Welcome, everybody, to the second day of Charleston Literary Festival. I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development and one of the chief party planners for the festival. We hope you had fun last night. Thank you to sponsors Betsy and Rusty Kellogg for sponsoring this session about memory, which they are doing in memory of Gail Kellogg, Rusty's late sister-in-law. It is my honor to introduce Charan Ranganath and Dr. David Adams. Charan is the professor at the Center for Neuroscience and Department of Psychology and director of the Dynamic Memory Lab at the University of California at Davis. His book, Why We Remember, is a New York Times and Los Angeles Times bestseller. For over 25 years, he has studied the mechanisms in the brain that allow us to remember past events. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and the editor of the Journal of Neuroscience, the most influential academically edited journal in the field of neuroscience. In addition to being one of the world's top memory researchers, Dr. Ranganath is a songwriter and guitarist, and he has a number of recording credits, including a feature film soundtrack. Dr. David Adams is a beloved Charleston doctor, one of the city's loveliest men, and a dedicated triathlete. Dr. Adams was a Moorhead Scholar. He was chief of surgery at the U.S. Naval Hospital, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where he was the only surgeon. In 1983, he became the chief of surgery at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Charleston, and then chief of surgery at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Adams' distinguished medical career has prepared him to be an excellent interlocutor for you. Please enjoy this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you, Sharon, for visiting us here in Charleston. I loved your book, and it was one of those great science books that makes complicated science understandable to the lay person, like a Richard Feynman or a Stephen Hawking. So it's a lot of questions are answered here, and many in this audience have these same questions. I know everyone in this audience is interested in the hereafter. As for example, when you walk into the kitchen and look at the refrigerator and say, what am I hereafter? Well, you're going to learn why that doesn't matter, and also how to find your keys, your wallet, and that word on the tip of your tongue. But to get us started, will you just tell us a little bit about your story? How do you get from being a toddler in San Jose to being professor of neurosciences?
Totally by accident. I guess I can give you ones that are very long, but then everyone will start walking out. So I'll give you the shortest version, which is that I actually was raised with the idea that I was supposed to be an engineer, and so I went into college as an engineering major. And I realized within my first year I hated engineering. So no offense to the engineers out there. My dad's one. So, but after like my first year, I was really floating around, and I ended up landing in the field of psychology, and decided to go into grad school in clinical psychology. But then I started studying people with brain damage, and it just made me realize how much memory is involved in everything, because almost anyone who came into the clinic, whether it was somebody who was worried that they had Alzheimer's disease, or somebody who had experienced a traumatic brain injury, somebody who had a stroke, whatever it was, the complaint was always memory. And it was either them coming in worried about their memory, or the more worrisome one was when a family member was bringing them in and saying that they were worried about their memory problem. And I soon realized how much of an impact it has on people's ability to live independently. And so brain imaging was just taking off at that time, and the ability to do functional MRI and map out brain activity patterns. And so I decided to just make the leap from clinical work into research, and I just never looked back.
So you were born at the right time when functional MRI came into fruition, but there was a lot of memory work that was done before MRI was available. What are some of the notables in the history of memory research that still are important for us to remember today?
Oh, there's so many. I guess the most famous one would be the example of Henry Mollison, or HM. And so, as a surgeon, I'm sure you can appreciate this story because it's one of the great the great neurosurgical story in history. But he was studied by a woman named Brenda Milner, who was just phenomenal. She's still alive. Talk about brain health. She's, I think, 105 now and still functions amazingly well. Still working in the lab. But Brenda actually was studying this patient who had a bilateral temporal lobectomy. So they did surgery in the temporal lobes for epilepsy. And the mistake that the surgeon made was that he didn't really know, but then again, he was doing surgery on people with schizophrenia and depression. And so it's not a great, he just decided to do this, but it was on both sides of the temporal lobes. And so he unknowingly basically wiped out the memory circuitry of his brain. And so as a result, he was able to walk and talk and do many things that at the time a neurosurgeon would say, well, this is a success. But you'd walk out for 30 seconds and come back and he wouldn't have remembered having met you before. And so that's when we started to realize that memory actually there are some areas in the brain that are absolutely essential for our ability to remember. And that's just one example of many, but I think that's the most notable example for sure.
And that strikes home to me for some of the reasons you mentioned, but also when I did anatomy as a freshman medical student, we didn't dissect the brain. And I always thought it was just one big mass of scrambled eggs. And so what I loved in your book is that all these wonderful networks get identified and understandable. And so that the brain becomes not such a mystery, but something like, well, your heart and your lungs and your kidneys, they're all connected. So there are these wonderful words, and they're kind of turnoffs, but I just love to say them because they're beautiful. The hippocampus, the amygdala, which means almond, and hippocampus is a seahorse, and then of course, prefrontal cortex, and then the hardest one for me to remember was the default mode network. So tell us something about, I know your research has been really huge in episodic memory. How do you fit these parts together? How does the network connect?
Well, this is, I think, one of the great mysteries still, is that we don't fully know the answers, and this has definitely been something I'm studying. And so just to fill in for people who haven't read the book, episodic memory is this ability to be able to revisit a time from a past experience in your life. So it'd be like you smell something and it reminds you of the last time you had lunch with your grandmother or something. And so that ability to be able to localize information to a place and time is dependent on this area of the brain called the hippocampus. It's a very old area of the brain. Fish have something like it. Birds have something like it. Of course, primates have something like it. Rats do. And so this area of the brain is thought to have evolved in part to help us remember where we are. And in fact, we've actually done some research with sea lions on sea lions who actually ended up eating algae that had, or they ate fish that ate algae that had this toxin in it that actually was neurotoxic to the hippocampus. And so these sea lions would end up wandering around and they didn't know where they were. And then they would end up washing up on the beach. And so we can see this importance in so many species of the role of the hippocampus in orienting us in space and time, right? So I woke up in the middle of the night last night because I have sleep issues, and I wake up and I'm in a hotel room and I look around and I have this brief moment where I'm just like, where am I? And if it wasn't for my ability to remember how I got there, I would have no idea. I would just be, a prisoner in this random room, right? So the hippocampus seems to be really important for localizing us in space and time. The amygdala is very important for giving us a sense of what's important enough to remember and really modulating, opening up the gates of memory, so to speak, so that the hippocampus can especially encode memories that are biologically important to us, things that are associated with surprise or novelty or fear or desire. And so that's a very key player too. And the prefrontal cortex is exceptionally important for being able to help us use memory to get the job done, to actually focus us on our goals. And so this is something that unfortunately I'm experiencing, many of you might be too, is that the prefrontal cortex's function as you get older starts to decline a little bit. And so we often remember the inane things at the expense of the important things. And so this is something that I think many of us experience as we get older because it's just a natural part of development. And then finally, the default network is really a very new discovery post-brain imaging. And it seems to be this network of areas in the brain that is important for being able to help us play out sort of the general situation that's taking place, so to speak. So for instance, if you've been at the Lit Fest, you could walk in with predictions about what this discussion might look like just based on other experiences that you've had like this. And so it allows us to pull up these scripts in our head that help us efficiently form new memories and fill in the blanks in our memories sometimes and reconstruct what happens even if we didn't remember all the details.
So it has the blueprints, and I love your analogy of Legos, and that the hippocampus has the instructions and the default mode network has the blocks. That helps connect the two.
Yes, yeah, and that's actually one of the things that we saw in some of our brain imaging work is it just seemed like you could actually find a little so-called fingerprint in the brain for particular blocks, so to speak, like, you know, you'd have another event that takes place here, you'd see a brain activity pattern that's associated with this place, but it gets reused in a new memory, and you build new memories with the same blocks, which is why our brains are so efficient. And that's why we never run out of space, is because we're always reusing the elements that we have.
We had good examples of both those yesterday in our talks by Andre Asselman, who told about his horrid Uncle Claude, who had not 1 ounce of human kindness, but when he smelled Andre's mother baking some artichokes, he teared up. Uncle Claude did, because it reminded him of his mother. And then the other great example was Paul Murray talking about being stuck in a novel. What was he going to do next? And he went out for a walk with his dog, and all of a sudden the answer came to him. And that was sort of the default mode network kicking in, isn't it? The sort of goofing off part of the brain.
Yeah, that's what they used to think, is that it was all goofing off. But then we found that, in fact, it often, what we would call goofing off, at least, you know, sort of type A neuroscientists, is often actually us planning and imagining. And that daydreaming, which we kind of look down upon, is also, I think, at the root of so much human creativity and generativity.
We mentioned, smells as being something that is a cue for episodic memory. What are the other things that help you remember time and place?
Well, so smells are a big one, but another one is songs. I mean, how many of you, just out of curiosity, have heard a song and it brings you back to a particular time and place? Okay, so almost all of you, right? So music is such an effective cue because we often have particular songs that we listen to at a particular time in our life. And so when it pops up on the radio and you haven't heard that song in 20 years, it's a unique cue that transports you and opens up the door to all of these memories that happened during that time. Being in a place can be like this too. So if you go to a place that you haven't been to in a long time, or even a place that reminds you of somewhere that you haven't been to in a long time, it can bring back these memories that you didn't think that you had before. And so places, sounds, and smells tend to evoke particular contexts, and that's what the hippocampus does, is it forms these little memories that are tied to a context, a place and time and situation, and that's what you need to get back to past memories.
You talk about event boundaries and things that recollect memories, and we had an example of that yesterday from our friend Jane, who remembers buying a woolen dress in 1986 and walked out of the dressing room, and everybody was looking at her all, astonished, and she thought it was because of her, but that happened to be the day of the Challenger.
Oh.
So that's in a memory that she'll never forget all the details that go along with that. How does that work?
Well, like, so so in terms of like, are we thinking about the episodic memory of the Challenger
Yes.
thing, or event boundaries, or both?
Both.
So one of the things that I think happens to many of us just in terms of event boundaries is that sometimes you'll end up walking into the kitchen and then you realize, oh, I have no idea why I'm here. What's going on? And so part of the issue is that our brains are, again, trying to form little scripts for what we're supposed to be doing that are based on where we are and what our goals are. But when we change the room, it turns out that your brain flips that model and says, okay, I'm in a new place. And so often we forget what was happening right before we crossed through that doorway. And so you can actually see this even if somebody's watching a movie. You'll see that if a hero crosses from one room into another, there'll be a big spike in activity. And so we call those spikes in activity, we call them event boundaries. There are these breaks between where your brain says one event is over and another event has begun, right? And so in the example that you gave, walking out, she was thinking about one thing, but then when she was confronted with this reality of the Challenger explosion, then all of a sudden her mental model, her idea of what's happening at the moment had to completely update. And so what we can see is at the end of these events, at the boundaries, our brains seem to encode a memory for what happened right beforehand. And then it sort of flushes it out and you get into what's happening right now. And so often it can be harder to go back, 30 seconds across an event boundary in memory than it is to go back a couple of minutes if the event has stayed pretty much the same.
So say more about comparisons between episodic memory and semantic memory.
So episodic memory is this ability to remember a unique event in your life. And semantic memory is the knowledge that we have that we carry with us to different places and different times. And so an example that I'll give an example right now that I can give, which is that when I look back now, I can have a memory for an experience that I've had in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's separate from all the knowledge that I have about South Carolina that I picked up over this trip. And so that ability to be able to remember an event is really important, because often if you can't remember where you put your keys, the problem isn't that you don't know what keys are. The problem isn't that you don't know where you usually put your keys. It's where you want to be able to remember, where did I put my keys just 5 minutes ago? And to be able to do that, the brain has to be able to form an episodic memory for 5 minutes ago that's separate from every other time that you put down your keys. And so part of why episodic memory is so hard is because we have so many competing memories, right? So if I meet someone named David, and then my brain is saying, well, there's a bunch of memories I have of different people I've met named David. And so there's all this confusion there between all these similar memories that our brain is trying to sort out. And so the hardest memory problems we have tend to be these episodic memory problems, where our brain is trying to sort out differences between memories that are overlapping or similar to each other.
And so, for example, it'd be easier to remember that John is a baker than that Mr. Baker's name is Baker.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And unfortunately now it's like you go up to somebody named Baker and they don't give you bread anymore. So
It's even harder.
exactly.
So you talk about time travel and the hippocampus, and that's a rich area. Tell us more.
Well, one of the weirdest discoveries we've had about memory is that the ability to remember the past actually is so relevant to our understanding of the present and our ability to imagine the future. So Endel Tulving, the memory researcher who came up with the term episodic memory, he studied this patient named KF who had had a motorcycle accident. He had major amnesia. But it turned out he also couldn't imagine the future. You could say, hey, what do you think you'll be doing an hour from now? Nothing. It was a complete blank slate. It was like he couldn't see it in his head. And so later on, people started to study other patients with amnesia and found similar kinds of problems that they have, that they couldn't project what their lives would be at a different place and a different time. And when people started doing brain imaging studies, what they found was these same areas of the brain that were active when I remember something from the past that I've actually experienced could also be active when people are imagining something that hasn't yet happened, or maybe something that never could happen. And so we've started to understand that that machinery for remembering events is actually a machinery for being able to imagine how things could be. And so that when we remember the past, we're not replaying it. We're not pushing a button in our head that says, hey, let's replay this memory. It's really, we're imagining how the past could have been. And that's the same machinery that we use to say, what can the future be? What's happening right now in the present? Those are all various acts of imagination.
And so we actually don't remember the past, we imagine it.
That's right, that's right. And so while I wouldn't say all memory is fiction, what I would say is that memory is like a painting, that you don't go up to a painting and say, well, a painting is true or a false. It's just a painting. Paintings will have some degree of realism to them, but they'll also have some degree of whatever the subject they're trying to paint could be inaccurate. And there can be parts that are neither true nor false. They just reflect the artist's unique perspective on the world. And I think that's how our memories are. And that's why sometimes it can be frustrating because we have loved ones and we look back on an experience that we've shared and they remember it completely differently from how we do because they painted their past in a very different way than we have. But that's just part of the way memory works naturally.
So memory is, as you say, a copy of a copy of a copy. And sometimes it works well, but not always. So there are a lot of issues that you talk about that I think are pertinent today, such as misinformation, social distortion, fake news. Tell us how that works.
Well, so one of the things that we know about the way individuals remember is that our memories tend to be incomplete. That is, we don't remember everything that we've experienced, in fact, remarkably incomplete. And the things that we do remember, we'll often imagine them based on how we feel right now, what we believe right now. And so our view of the past is based on our beliefs and biases that we have in the time that we're generating that memory. But then on top of it, the act of remembering can actually change the memory so that if I remember the same experience over and over and over again, every time I remember it, I can strengthen the memory, but I can also weaken certain parts of the memory, and I can start to incorporate wrong information into the memory. Now, if we were all just living in bubbles independently, it wouldn't make a difference. But the problem is that we live in these societies, and so much of our memory is really the seeds for human communication. I mean, I think about probably half of our time that we spend talking to each other, we're sharing memories, right? And so the problem is that we're very susceptible to information and memory being corrupted when we share memories with other people and then they give information to us. And so what can happen is through social interactions, our memories can become more selective. They can become more biased sometimes, and they can become inaccurate sometimes when we get misinformation and we don't remember where that misinformation came from. So that's the downside of it. The plus side of it is those same social factors also give us tremendous opportunities because we can improve our memories through social interactions. We can see this in older people, for instance, in couples. They tend to cognitively do a lot better because they can work off of each other's cognitive strengths and compensate for each other's memory issues. And we can see that in the ability to change memories is hugely important for psychotherapy, and it's why support groups for people like an Alcoholics Anonymous or support groups of people who've had post-traumatic stress disorder are enormously helpful because they share these memories, and the sharing of memories allows them to change their narratives and allows them to update their memories in a way that's actually positive.
So tell us some about the aging brain. The hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. What's going on?
Well, there's so much that happens over the course of development in general that, you know, it's funny because all of my work is really on this like zone of time in the brain where like everything's supposed to be perfect. It's
Right.
These 18 to 22-year-old brains. And of course, if you actually read the literature, you'd almost think that we have about 10 years of good cognitive functioning and then everything else is garbage, you know? But what we can see is that the brain actually develops pretty continuously across the lifespan. And so during childhood, you have this incredibly plastic brain, and that's why little children can learn languages so easily. It's because all over the cortex, information can come in and stick very easily. But then as we get older, we've built up all of this knowledge about the world, that plasticity window goes down. But in adolescence, the prefrontal cortex is still developing, and that is sometimes why people will say, well, teenagers can be a little reckless sometimes because they're not really thinking about the future. They're kind of more based on what's going on in the present. And then we hit adulthood, and the prefrontal cortex, its wiring to the rest of the brain is looking really good, and that's that period of time where neuroscientists say this is your ideal moment, right? But then in the 30s, memory performance starts to decline on average, and that decline goes down gradually from the 30s. As you keep getting older, on average, it gets worse and worse and worse. Now, one of the things we're realizing, though, is that there's so much variability in it. So two people could be, I'm right now starting a collaboration with somebody who studies superagers. And so these are people at the age of 80 who have memory performance that's like the equivalent of somebody at the age of 50.
Who are those people?
Well, we know very little about them right now, but we're starting to understand some of the factors that seem to promote healthy brain aging versus non-healthy brain aging. So just in general, what you start to see is as people get older, the prefrontal cortex starts to thin a little bit, and people get a little bit more distractible. They have trouble staying on task. They tend to ramble a little bit. Not that any of you do this, but but it happens to some of us as we get older, and that's a natural part of the way the prefrontal cortex changes. But then sometimes you can see additional problems that are not sort of typical in the sense that they shouldn't necessarily be happening. Like if you have hypertension and high cholesterol, the cerebrovascular disease can cause little strokes that can actually cause all sorts of disconnection to be happening in the brain. And so that can really exaggerate people's memory problems and even cause a dementia called vascular dementia, which is very common and often comorbid with Alzheimer's. Sometimes people have a trajectory towards Alzheimer's disease pathology, and that's when the hippocampus really starts to degenerate as well. So there seems to be these multiple pathways that happen with aging, and we're now just starting to realize that there's a lot that can be done in terms of people's lifestyles to really shape which path you end up going down as you get older.
So what are those things that we all need to do that we don't want to do?
They are unfortunately things that we don't necessarily want to do, or at least the modern life doesn't make easy for us to do, right? So physical exercise is a big one. From the studies of the superagers, what's becoming pretty clear is superagers tend to be very physically active, and they tend to be very socially active. They tend to be very socially engaged with their community. They have close relationships. And so you never know what's the cause and what's the effect. Is it what's the chicken and what's the egg? But it does seem to be a very important factor that's coming out in all of the work on aging is physical fitness and socializing and social connection and a sense of purpose seems to be one. There's many things. If you can think of almost anything that your doctor tells you you're supposed to be doing for your health, that's going to be good for your brain health. So
chocolate's still good. That's
chocolate, right. The chocolate lobby will tell you that for sure. But there's a lot of things that people will say, oh, well, you should take this supplement or take this, drink this or eat this and blah, blah, blah. And I think diet is very important in general, and there's a lot of probably different people have different optimal diets, but there's all sorts of things that I think are fairly easy, sort of low-hanging fruit, like if you have hearing problems, wear a hearing aid. It's really been associated with improved cognitive functioning and reduced susceptibility to neurodegenerative disease. If you have eye problems like cataracts, get that treated. The sensory deficits seem to be a really big problem. Oral hygiene turns out to be one. It turns out that getting gum disease can increase your risk for neurodegenerative diseases. We're learning about all sorts of things. Like long COVID seems to be just absolutely terrible. So to the extent that you can get vaccinated and stay healthy, it's super important. So right now, the list of things that we can do is actually growing and growing. And the nice thing is that many of these things are pretty easy, actually. And even the hard things like exercise, they actually will make it easier for you to do other things, like get a good night's sleep, and make it easier for you to preserve your mental health and stay resilient to depression and so forth, and reduce your stress. And so, I get it. The struggle's real. I struggle to do many of these things myself, but it's definitely something that we can take into our own hands. And if you look at Alzheimer's disease, the Lancet reported that about half of the risk factors that you have for Alzheimer's disease are preventable with lifestyle change.
So Paul Murray mentioned something yesterday that made me think of another topic that you address very cogently. And he was talking about the Twin Peaks series and how everybody wanted to figure out who killed Laura Palmer. And then when they did, they were all disappointed. And so what that spoke to me was that curiosity is something that doesn't make us feel good, but it enhances memory. Tell us about curiosity and how that figures into the equation.
Well, so I started doing research on this topic because I had a postdoctoral researcher in my lab named Matthias Gruber, and he came in saying, I want to study curiosity. And at that time, I had zero curiosity about this topic. Everybody knows you'll remember something better if you're interested in learning it. But he convinced me, and it turned out that he was absolutely right. So we did this research, and I think the two most surprising things about our studies were, number one, that when people are more curious, we can see an increase in activity in these areas of the brain that are involved in processing dopamine. So dopamine is this neurotransmitter. Many of you might have heard of it in relation to reward or pleasure. And sometimes people talk about it as pleasure chemical, but it's actually wrong. In fact, actually, most of the research suggests that if anything, dopamine is about energizing you to get rewards, right? It's that itch that motivates you to get up and grab that pizza or something like that. But it's not necessarily a pleasant feeling, like you said, right? And so one of the things we found is that the more curious people were to find the answer to a question, the more activity we would see. So it wasn't about the reward of the knowledge, but it was about the thrill of getting the knowledge. And then the other part was, during that window of time when you see this dopamine spike, we could show people, let's say, a face or something like that, and people were better able to learn the face if they were in the state of high curiosity. So it was as if curiosity opened up people's minds to take in new information, even if it wasn't what they were looking for, right? And this is why you want to, in Twin Peaks or Breaking Bad or whatever, you want to have the commercial right before the conclusion to the show.
So 90% of humans' time on Earth, we've been, hunter-gatherers. How does the brain makeup figure into the evolutionary development of the species? Talk a little bit about brain structure and evolution. What's there that is really working well?
Well, so this was a big part of the way that I was thinking about this book, is the past is the past, it's over with. So you don't really need it, right? The only things that you need from the past are what you need to make sense of the present and survive the future, right? And so I took a very evolutionary slant in this book, which is very much thinking about memory like a resource that we want to use to survive in an uncertain and dangerous world. And just like when I packed for this trip, as much as I was tempted to, I didn't pack everything. I tried to fly only carry-on because I don't trust the airlines to hold on to my baggage. And so I didn't bring everything with me that I possibly could have. I brought as much as I thought I would need for this trip, right? And I think this is how our brains are really optimized to work. And so factors like things that are new and things that are biologically important, like things that might be threatening or things that might be objects of our desire, for instance, those drive memory in a fundamental way. And I think what human memory really has is that human brains have this long window of childhood where we're really open to all sorts of information, right? And so during childhood, the brains are optimized really to learn through play and curiosity. We're really optimized to learn through exploration and seeing what's around us and actively engaging with our environment. Then we become young adults, and the brain is now optimal, so to speak, for focusing on our goals. How do we get things done, right? And so any new parent knows you don't wake up and say, like, what do I have to do today? You just have so many things to do. It's like, which thing do I have to do right now? And so you have to stay very goal focused, right? And then throughout much of human history, as people got older, their job wasn't about themselves or their own goals. It's really about the community around them. And if you look at so many societies, especially hunter-gatherer societies, the elders were the ones who would keep the traditions. They would know about the medicines and the foraging traditions, the language, and so forth. And they would be the ones passing on that knowledge to other generations. And so it's not about holding on to my goals and how can I plan for my future, but really it becomes much more about everyone around you. And so I've started to think about the trajectory of the brain through development, and it's kind of mirroring the different roles that people have as they go through their lifespan within this kind of social world that we live in, because so much of human evolution is based on social interactions.
And humans share that with elephants and whales in that their lifespan extends way beyond reproductive times. So they need to carry on a little bit of semantic memory. Is that what's going on?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and semantic memory stays solid up into old age, as people can be in their 90s, and their knowledge about things is actually quite solid in most cases. And so if you look at other species, I'm glad you reminded me about this. One of my favorite points in writing the book was I got to read about orcas. And I mean, what's not to love about orcas, right? But orcas are one of the few species, like elephants is another, where females live past menopause. And they have a long lifespan past menopause. And if you look at a pod of orcas, who leads the pod of orcas? Well, it's the females. The eldest females will be the ones who would be leading the pod, and they're passing on the tradition. So different pods of orcas have all these different kinds of cultural knowledge. Some will go hunt sharks. Some will go, like, play with particular things. And they have different kinds of cultural traditions, different kinds of calls and languages. And this is all being led by the elder females in these groups. And so I just thought it was like really poignant to think of another species that is so social and so intelligent that has this kind of trajectory to their brains.
So make us seniors feel good about taking that afternoon nap. What are the benefits of nap and sleep to the brain?
Yeah, there's so many actually. So number one, when we sleep, our brains flush out a lot of the toxins that accumulate throughout the day. So amyloid protein, which is a protein that's been implicated in Alzheimer's disease, gets flushed out in the lymphatic system during sleep, for instance. Another thing is that our brains are quite active during sleep, and there's this whole different periods of time during sleep, like REM sleep and slow wave sleep, where our brains go into these different modes. And so slow wave sleep, it's like you see this symphony of neural activity kind of going through in these waves that travel all around the brain. And then REM sleep, when we have dreams, is like this free jazz where everything's kind of going crazy. And it's almost like as if you're looking at the brain of somebody who's awake, but they can't move. And so we're starting to realize that during each of these stages, there's this dialogue happening between different brain regions that allows us to take the experiences of the day and consolidate those memories into knowledge that we can take with us. And so my friend Matt Walker, who wrote a book called Why We Sleep, he and I were talking, and I remember him saying this. He didn't actually remember himself saying this, but I remember him saying, sleep allows us to convert our experiences into a tapestry of wisdom, which I really like.
And so that's why when you say, I think I want to sleep on that problem, that's not a bad idea.
It's not.
You may solve it.
That's right. That's right. And I think the last thing is not getting enough sleep is horrible. It's really bad for your brain function. People's memory performance tanks if they're not getting enough sleep. And so we can see this in people with sleep apnea, in particular sleep disorders like sleep apnea, terrible effects on memory. So there's both positive effects of sleeping and negative effects of not sleeping. So if any of you sleep during the rest of this conversation, I will forgive you for it.
So, mentioned something about deja vu. We all think that we're psychic when we have these deja vu episodes. And I love the quote you had by the author who said, "Right now I'm having amnesia and deja vu at the same time." I think I've forgotten that before. So what is deja vu? What's the brain doing when you're at a new situation? You say, "Oh, I've been there before in my past life."
Well, what we think is happening is that our brain is partially activating something that's common to a number of memories that we have, but it's mismatching it enough that it doesn't activate any particular memory. And so, and we know this is something that can happen even in the absence of any real memory, because in the early studies of epilepsy, Hewlings-Jackson, the neurosurgeon, or neurologist or neurosurgeon, probably both, but he discovered that many patients with epilepsy would have this intense sense of deja vu right before they would go into a seizure. And so they would just feel this massive sense of familiarity. And it was basically a sign that they were about to have a seizure. And so other people like Wilder Penfield would stimulate areas of the brain right before he would do his surgeries, and found that if you stimulated these areas in the temporal lobes, some of the areas that were actually damaged in patient HM, people would have these intense experiences of familiarity. And so one of my friends, Ann Cleary, has done all this great research where she's used virtual reality, and she'll take people and have them walk through a virtual museum, and then later on she'll have them walk through a virtual video game arcade. But it turns out in virtual reality, she's taken the exact same places and put objects in the exact same spots, but one just looks like a museum, one just looks like an arcade, but they're basically the same place. And what she finds is that people are dramatically more likely to report deja vu if they're in a place that looks like a place that they've been before. So it's part of our brain's natural familiarity circuitry. It's the same thing that allows us to go see someone and we're like, I know I've met this person before, but I don't know where or when or how I've seen them, but I know it, right? So it's this feeling that you have a memory somewhere in there, but you don't.
So the brain is so interesting in time, and we talked about time travel. And we all had that experience during COVID where the days would drag by and the weeks would flash by. What's going on there? What's confusing us?
Well, so part of it is that during COVID, we were stuck in the same place, spending the same time with the same people, doing the same activities. Like, so basically you're sitting in your room in front of a computer, clicking, talking on Zoom and so forth. And so what happened is that people's normal lives have these natural boundaries to them. We would go from one place to another. We had schedules. We had people that we would see in the real world. And so when you deprive people of all these big differences in what would happen in the day-to-day structure of their experiences, they started to get this extreme sameness to their memories. And that sameness kind of led people to be like they're floating in space and time. And so I actually did, since I was doing Zoom, I had to do something to keep my students entertained and make sure that they were looking at the screens. And so I polled them and I just asked them out of the blue, I just said, hey, how many of you feel like your days are going by faster or slower? And everyone said that their days were going by slower. But then I said, how about the weeks? Do you feel like the weeks are going by slower or faster? And most people said they felt like their weeks were disappearing faster. So, of course, this violates all the laws of physics, right? So how is it that your days can go by so slowly, but your weeks disappear? And the reason is that people would go through their day and they couldn't remember anything specific. And so because they didn't have any of these changes, they just felt like they were in this endless event. They didn't have these event boundaries marking their different experiences. But then after a week, they would look back and they didn't really remember what had happened in the past week because they'd just been in the same place doing the same thing. And so without all this trove of memories to look back on, it just seemed like the week disappeared on them before they knew it.
So I've got a story I want to tell you, and it leads to a question. So the story is a Norm Macdonald story, and it has to do about a guy named Jim who was having memory problems and got a new medicine. And he talked to his buddy about it, and his friend said, well, what's the name of that medicine? And he said, oh, just a minute. It's on the tip of my tongue. What's that flower, that romantic flower that you take on a date? Oh, you mean a carnation or a tulip? No, it's the red one, long-stemmed one. And he said, oh, yeah, a rose. It's a rose. Oh, yeah. And then he turns to the next room and says, hey, Rose, what's the name of that medicine I'm on? All right, enough of that. Why don't you all ask some real questions now, please? So these are what we would like you to do, is wait for the microphone, stand if you are able, ask one question at a time that ends with a question mark. We can't remember 2 questions. And please, deliver the mics, yes. And the other thing is you have to love the microphone 3 inches from your mouth.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you very much for this fascinating. Question is, how is our intuition linked to our memory?
Well, this is a great question. So we think that how is intuition related to memory is the question. And in some ways, a lot of what we're talking about, déjà vu, could be relevant here. So one of the things that we know is that when we can have some situation that's familiar to us, you'll see actually a reduction in activity in these circuits in the brain that are processing this information, right? And so this can basically is a sign that our brains are really efficiently engaging in whatever it is we're doing. And so that allows us to, I realize I'm not answering this question as clearly as I could, but basically what we think of is that same mechanism that allows us to say this is a familiar situation allows us to take a guess about what's going to come up next, and it allows us to more efficiently plan for what's going to happen. And sometimes that can manifest as a feeling of intuition. And so I suspect that intuition is strongly related to familiarity, but we don't know for sure.
A lot of questions. We need more microphones, that's all. Yeah, here it comes. Let's go to the back.
Yes, I walked in a few minutes late, so if you covered this, I apologize. Could you speak to whether or not photographic memories are real and what they actually entail?
This is a great question. So when I meet people, 9 out of 10 will say I have a terrible memory, and 1 out of 10 say I have a photographic memory. And so I will say that there's a proper photographic memory you will not see. What you will see are people who have an enormously detailed memory in some particular area in their life. And what I mean by this is, there's some people like Stephen Wiltshire, who's on the autistic spectrum, who can be in a helicopter and fly over a city and paint this beautiful painting of everything he saw, almost like a map. It's not perfect, but it's very close to photographic. But in other areas of his life, he doesn't have nearly as detailed of a memory. There are people who have what's called highly superior autobiographical memory. And so these are people who can tell you, 3 years ago, if I look back 3 years and 4 months ago, they'll be able to tell you, what was playing on TV, what the weather was like, what they were wearing, and so forth. But then you say, okay, here, memorize these 4 phone numbers, and they won't be any better than anyone else. So for whatever reason, we think that some people have this enormously good capability to remember in particular areas and not in others. Often what can happen too is when we have a really good ability to visualize, our memories can feel very photographic, even if we don't have all those details in front of us. And you'll see the opposite. It turns out there's people who have what's called severely deficient autobiographical memory. And these people often report that they can't mentally picture anything. It's called aphantasia. They'll say they don't have any, mind's eye, so to speak. And their memory for their lives is actually very poor. And they have, if they were telling you what they did last week, it would be almost like they read it about someone in a book. It's not anything that they can re-experience. And yet, they seem to have no problems learning in school and performing well. In fact, actually, one of my colleagues thinks I have severely deficient autobiographic memory, so
That's
maybe
me.
I'm a little biased on the topic. So there seems to be something about like particular windows of memory that people can have that can be extraordinarily detailed, but no one has ever been discovered who remembers everything about everything.
Right here. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ranganath and Dr. Adams. I read the Kindle version of your book. I read your book on the Kindle, and I particularly loved the way you did your notes. It was very different from the way I usually see notes, because you didn't use footnotes with numbers. You just put them all in the notes in the back and with websites and links to them. So I thought that was really great. But here's my question. You wrote about the challenge of writing, of your writing process and the value of mentors and getting feedback from them. So my question is, what behaviors and or technologies do you find useful in your, or not useful in your writing process?
This was one of the most surprising things to me. Thank you about the notes, by the way, because it ended up being about 1/3 of the book. Yeah. My publisher was like, oh, well, can you just put these online? I said, no, I'm a scientist. We need to have all the sources. And then I saw the book and I realized that 1/3 of it is notes. And then I thought maybe I should have been a little more flexible on that. But I'm glad someone read them. Thank you. And I had a lot of fun doing that because I got to just riff on things that I didn't have space to talk about in the book. And one of the things I found really helpful in writing the book was mainly a change in the way that this isn't quite answering your question, but it may be useful, which is that I thought I've been teaching this topic for over 20 years. You know, I know exactly what I want to say. I know how to write it. And then I wrote it, and or I would write sections, and people who were in the field would read it and go, this is terrible. And I soon realized that it's like, you know, it's almost like you get somebody who's trained as a classical musician and then you throw them in with Miles Davis and expect them to do well, right? It's a completely different style of writing and communication. And so a big thing that I had to learn in this process was to learn how to tell a story. And so I have enormous respect for writers now in a way that I didn't appreciate before, because I just thought writing is just what you write. But now I realized I went through so many drafts, deleted so many sentences. I mean, every sentence in the book is accompanied by 6 that got killed. And so that was a big part of the process for me, was learning how to write fiction based on a true story. And,
Question over here.
yeah, sorry, I kind of went on, but I didn't find a tool for that. It was just people, really. People were my biggest help.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I have a question, I guess, related to stress and memory. And so going to the Citadel, obviously they try to stress you out. And so why is it that, like, I have a hard time remembering some of the formulas we talked about in my thermodynamics class, but like when they yell at us, you know, trying to pick up our rifles and stuff like that, I can remember that, like, every single detail.
Great question.
It's fascinating. Stress has fascinating effects on memory, actually. So one of the things that we know is when we're stressed, there's a release of all these corticosteroid hormones in our brain, as well as noradrenaline, and they all promote plasticity. So they actually help us form memories for these stressful events. But weirdly, they also shut down the prefrontal cortex and crank up the amygdala. And so when that cortisol is being released, for instance, you're going to be more reactive to what's happening in the moment, but you're going to have a really hard time remembering stuff that happened right before you got stressed out. So it actually helps you form new memories, but it makes it worse for trying to remember old things. And it also makes our memories much more sticky for whatever is going on around us. We're not goal-focused as much, right? So when we're stressed, we tend to not focus in a way that's very logical or very methodical. We tend to be very, like, reactive to what's around us, right? And that's why, in fact, so much training involves being able to produce these things without thinking about them and being able to react and respond without thinking about it, because that way when you're under stress, you don't have to remember what was it that my drill sergeant told me. You just do it, right? And that doing it is actually quite independent of the circuitry from remembering that you experienced it. So that may be part of why you have this. Our brains are really naturally wired to help us remember things that are stressful, because if something happens that's stressful, you get yelled at by somebody, that's not a good thing. You don't want it to happen again, right? And so our brains are kind of optimizing to keep us protected for the future for those reasons.
Up front, yes, please.
Yeah, I have not read your book yet, and I don't know whether you
Oh,
addressed
no,
I
I'm
hope you
sorry, I
did.
can't answer
yet.
that.
It was a big yet. I absolutely intend to, but I'm struck by some parallels of things that you're talking about in terms of brain process and brain architecture, and what might exist in artificial intelligence and computer science, and whether some of the research that you're doing and your colleagues are doing is partly informing the development of artificial intelligence. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Great question.
I have so many thoughts on that. I would love to do a whole session on
You
this
have
topic.
4 minutes and 22 seconds.
Okay, so that's unfortunately what I'm not good at, is very quickly. No, yeah, we have a lot of thought about it, because at the heart of artificial intelligence is machine learning. And it turns out one of the biggest problems they have in machine learning is this problem of what's called continual learning, which is that once you learn and learn and learn and you keep learning new things, there's a tension between learning new stuff and holding on to the old stuff that you know, especially if you're learning, well, here's an exception to this rule that I learned a long time ago. And so we think that the hippocampus is this part of the brain that helps us balance between something like the neocortex is more of like ChatGPT, basically. It just kind of gets, in general, what's the right answer. And the hippocampus is the brain area that allows us to say, this weird thing happened to me in this place and in this time, that's the exception to everything else I've ever experienced. And so we're developing computer models of memory right now that incorporate both of these kinds of systems to be able to be more flexible and learn. And so I think that's going to be a big direction that the field is going to go in general. But there are things that just make us human and make episodic memory unique to each and every one of you that cannot be replicated by AI, which I think is kind of cool.
Who's got the mic? In the back, yes.
Hello. Thank you for a wonderful discussion, both of you. My question is simple. Does gender impact memory?
There's nothing that I've seen that dramatically says yes or no. What we do know is that there do seem to be some effects of the way stress impacts memory seems to vary by gender. So for instance, stress effects will be related to the release of these corticosteroid hormones. And so in women, the menstrual cycle will moderate the release of these hormones. And you can see also different effects of stress on memory for women on contraceptives than who are not. And so those hormonal factors seem to be important. Menopause seems to have some effects on memory, and there are definitely gender differences in susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately. And those seem to be the big ones. A lot of the stuff that people say, well, men are better at directions or whatever, and women are better at, remembering people's names or whatever, there's just not good data to support that. Or it's just these very small, narrow differences. But I think the big window that we need to really go into is looking at the neuroscience of women's health, because there's a lot there that we just don't know the answers to. But that's probably where the action is.
Who's got a mic? Over here, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to tell you that when I read your book and you talked about being a grad student at Northwestern and doing that experiment, I was there. But I don't remember if it was me or my roommate that did that experiment with the EEGs, so I thought it was ironic. But anyway, my question is about the context and the episodic memory of, you kind of talk about this context and that things that happened over and over again, like where you put your keys, are hard for people because it's within their home and they're always in their home. Mm-hmm. And then I feel like when people have dementia, we make their lives and world smaller. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there's any thoughts around either being, you know, in some way being able to like change the context in your mind when you walk into the same kitchen that you always walk into, you know, to have a kind of a memory trigger. And I appreciate that you say that it doesn't really matter if you can find your keys, but I also wonder if we're making it worse for people by making their worlds smaller and more redundant versus giving them new experiences.
Okay, so there's a lot there. Let me say, no, I'm not a criticism of your question. I'm just trying to, I just tend to go on and on and on. So I'm trying to be, so what I'll say is that part of context is not just where you are, but what you're thinking about, your feelings and everything that's going on at the time. And I think we can do a lot to sharpen our memory by actually being in, it sounds very cliche, but being in the moment, you know? And so the example I like to give is I like to see concerts, and I see kids just with their phones up, you know, and they're just recording the concert. And what I think is that you don't really want to be remembering the music that's playing. I mean, yes, you do, but what you really want to do is you want to remember the experience of you being there, the experience of connecting with your friends and connecting with the artist and the feelings that you have. And I think the problem that we often have is that we become disconnected from not only where we are, but we become disconnected from the experience of whatever it is we're supposed to be doing, because we're thinking about, you know, what's on our phone or something like that. We're getting alerts on our watch and so forth. And so I think that we can do a lot to improve our memory for these repetitive things, in part by engineering our environment where we don't, you know, I turned off alerts on my watch. I turn off alerts on my phone and so forth, and things like that that just pull you out, so that then what happens is your context is just this gray sense of I was in the house, but I don't really know what I was doing.
Unfortunately, the alert on my timer is going off. Time out. You've all been a lovely alert and awake audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You two were so good. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Betsy and Rusty Kellogg for sponsoring this session. We're so thankful for our donors. To buy a book from Buxton Books, it has a pop-up store. You're going to go in the back through the courtyard, in the back doors, and then take a left, and you can buy books, and they'll be signed. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well done. That was fun. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for all the fun.